All right, having completed our hearing on the proposed changes to UDO, we'll now call our regular scheduled board meeting to order of the Jefferson County Plan Commission, and we will start with our roll call.
Warren Oxer,
Here.
David Bramer,
Here.
Ray Black, Jenny Beverly,
Here.
Lisa Hammock,
Here.
Jean Riddle,
Here.
David Ferguson, Britt Copeland,
Here.
Mike Pittman.
Here. All right, we do have a quorum, so we'll continue with our meeting. Did you have an opportunity to review our regular meeting minutes from October 3rd of 2023? And if so, are there any changes or deletions? Okay, if not, I'd entertain a motion to approve.
So move.
All right, we have a first, do we have a second?
I'll second.
Okay, any further comments, discussion? If not, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye, all right. Minutes stand approved. We don't have any communications to go through this evening. And I'm willing to handle this however the board wants to handle it. I think that on these recommendations for a change, that we can go through them individually and we can have a decision made individually on them instead of just one entire group at the end. And so after we go through one, I'll be asking for discussion, so forth, any comments or changes. If we don't come up with anything there, would be asking for a motion to either give a favorable recommendation or a unfavorable recommendation. It's what, am I correct on that as to what we do? And then it will go to the commissioners for their final approval. So what we decide here is not the final word on it. So we'll basically use the same process. The first one I will start with is the irregularly shaped lots. And that in the case of irregularly shaped lot, which is unable to meet the 250 lot depth, the depth shall be waived, provided that said lot contains enough acreage to meet all the setback requirements for dwellings or other restrictions. Any comments or thoughts on that? If not, I'd entertain a motion to give a favorable or unfavorable recommendation to the commissioners.
So move.
Have moved, have second?
I'll second.
All right. Any other discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All right, we will give a favorable recommendation. We'll move on to the change on page 22 of the UDO, where we add the language of clarifying the amount of setback when there is not necessarily a dedicated right of way of the road. We have listed that as 25 feet from the right of way or 55 feet from the center of the road if the right of way is not dedicated by written recorded document. Any comments or thoughts on that? If not, entertain a motion.
Make a motion to approve.
Okay, do we have a second?
Second.
Second. All right, any other discussion? All those in favor? Aye. All right, that one passes unanimously. Move on to, I'll do these two together because they both tie in onto the wireless tires. The first is on page 34, that we are making a recommendation of removing the wireless community facility from a permitted use under a I-1 district and moving it to where it would be a special exception on the I-1 usages instead of a permitted use. And really, there's not much any action for us to take at all, since we're not going to be adding the language because of the existing state and federal statutes on page 78. So I really don't need a vote on that one. Any thoughts on the communication towers? If not, I'd entertain a motion that we make the change. We have a first, we have a second, we got a second. All those in favor? Aye. Our next one is on page 107 of our UDO that deals with the occupancy of manufactured homes. We have language there that currently reads that the manufactured home has to be no more than 10 years of age when the structure is initially placed on a lot. Indiana statute does not allow that language to exist at this point, so we are making an ordinance change to remove it. Any discussion? If not, entertain a motion to remove that language from us, make a recommendation to remove that language from us.
So moved.
All right,
Second.
second. All those in favor?
Aye.
All right. Now we'll move on. The one that we've had some discussion on is the shooting range definition, and open that up to the floor for discussion. And maybe it would help if we'd start. I'd ask Pat to review it some for us. If you'd come up and share some of the thoughts that you shared on definitions and where we're headed. And I think you possibly suggested taking one word out of it.
Yes, so first of all, I wanted to just talk about definitions briefly and just kind of remind everybody why we drafted this particular definition. So this same plan commission held a public hearing on the entire UDO. The UDO was a many months, if not years long process of getting the zoning ordinance completely restructured. There was a public hearing that took place at Ivy Tech, and at that time, the plan commission went over in detail all the things. There was no objection to any of the definitions that were reviewed at that time. It wasn't until the UDO was then presented to the commissioners for the commissioners' review that there was discussion about the definition of just one term out of many chapters of the UDO, shooting range, and whether or not a shooting range definition. So that's what then started the work as to whether or not a shooting range definition should be added. The definition that was proposed was drafted by me, and it was after reviewing numerous other ordinances from Indiana as well as other states, just trying my best to find something that was broad, but that would also have enough detail in it that members of the community and that the plan commission would be able to work with it. Definitions, I think, in the law, and I don't want to get up here and be professorial, but definitions are difficult because what I said back when the commissioners were talking about the issue is that under Indiana law, when a term does not have a provided definition by the ordinance or by the statute, the common law, the courts will give it its plain and ordinary meaning. So what that means is that just because a term doesn't have a definition in the ordinance or the statute doesn't mean that it lacks meaning. It still has a definition. It's just going to be given the plain and ordinary meaning as interpreted by the courts. Courts do it all the time. So as a really quick example, there's a statute that's been on the books for a long time. It's battery. Battery under Indiana law is knowingly or intentionally touching another person in a rude, angry, or insolent manner. And once you start getting into definitions, right, the next thing that happens is then you can ask, okay, but what are the definitions of the words in the definitions? So who's to say what is rude, or who's to say what is angry, or who's to say what is insolent? And the answer to that question is that we have a system of due process and we have a system of checks and balances. And what that means then is that if there is an enforcement action and someone challenges it and says, hey, you touched someone in a rude, angry, or insolent manner, then that person is entitled to due process. If there are criminal charges filed, then a fact finder, either a jury or a judge, would be the one that would actually be deciding, based on the interpretation given, whether or not that interpretation applies to the facts that have been presented using plain and ordinary meanings. So the dilemma with definitions is that if you define every term in a definition, then you have to define every term that's in the definition of the definition, and so on and so forth down the line. There was the written response did contain some criticisms, and one particular criticism that I thought was valid is in the first line of the definition. It uses the word primarily, and the written criticism points out that under that definition, if it's primarily, I think it uses the example of if you had a sports store that then had a shooting range set up in the sports store so that you could fire guns there, that the primary purpose would be to sell sports goods, but that the secondary purpose would be to have a shooting range, and therefore you would have essentially the exception would swallow the rule. So I agree with that particular criticism, and I think that the word primarily can be removed. I think the reason that it was there is, again, the definition is sort of an amalgamation of multiple definitions that were put together, and the primarily language I think is taken care of by the last sentence in the current definition. Because what the Plan Commission, was concerned about in talking about it is that Jefferson County does not have a discharge of firearms ordinance in the county. The city does. You can't just discharge firearms, but in the county, there's no ordinance that prevents the discharge of firearms. which means that we as a community generally accept that people on their own private property are entitled to, to do some target practicing, to do some shooting of guns. But that somewhere there's a line between that being something that you're doing what's called an accessory use, like an accessory to being, an owner of private property out in the county, versus that becoming something that is a regular, consistent, and frequent events on the property, and thereby something that is subject to the ordinance. So that last line is intended to address that point, that a shooting range does not include private property owners discharging firearms on the private property. So I think that the word primarily can come out, especially since that last sentence, kind of has that savings that as an accessory use, you can still discharge firearms on your own private property, so long as it's done on an infrequent basis. And I appreciate that these words, infrequent, like there is not, necessarily a set definition, but the problem is that, you could do that. You could say, oh, well, 16 shots, in a week counts as infrequent, but there's always going to be variations with that. And it's always going to be subject to, there's always going to be more interpretation to do. So take it all around, this I think was an effort to try to provide some guidance. Again, it's not required by the law that it be given a definition. Definitions, words take their plain and ordinary meaning. But overall, I think that the definition that's presented does provide some guidance, and provides enough guidance for both the members of the public as well as for the fact finders. And then as Mr. Oxer was pointing out, that in an enforcement situation, they would have due process. So there would be, first a call from the Planning Commission, then a review by Board of Zoning Appeals, there'd be court potential reviews. So the abuse of the definition is very unlikely in that circumstance. There are two other criticisms in the written document. Both of them are constitutional in nature. I don't think that there's nothing in this definition that is unconstitutional, nor is there anything in the regulation that is. For example, one of the concerns was that gun clubs would qualify as First Amendment protection. While that's true, that clubs are in fact, assembly under the First Amendment, there is plenty of room for regulation of time, place, and manner under the First Amendment. So for example, our ordinance covers churches, and that where and when a church is to be established is a time, place, and manner restriction. Churches are absolutely covered under the First Amendment. No one is looking to inhibit anybody's First Amendment rights. But there are allowed to be reasonable restrictions on time, place, and manner, and that's exactly what the UDO is intended to do. And similarly, the Second Amendment, as this commission is aware, there's been a challenge specifically to Jefferson County's enforcement of the zoning ordinance with regard to Second Amendment challenges, and that my position is that the current status of the Second Amendment does not prohibit time, place, and manner restrictions on the discharge of firearms, which is the only thing that this UDO is doing.
Anyone have any questions for that, the board?
I have a comment. Buffer zone. Can I legally discharge a firearm in the buffer zone?
Again, so the buffer zone, as far as I know, the answer is yes. So the buffer zone, the only thing that is covered by the city in the buffer zone is zoning.
Okay, all right.
And so if the city has a discharge ordinance, which it does, I don't believe that would be covered in the buffer zone. I would need to double check that, Gene,
Please.
if it's somehow been included into the zone.
Okay.
I
would be curious.
The buffer zone only covers zone. That's the
Okay.
only thing that the city has
Okay.
regulatory coverage.
What's thoughts on removing the word primarily from the definition, or any other thoughts on the definition of the whole as it's written? I think it strengthens it and clarifies it some to take primarily out. Personally, in the 8+ years that I have been on the Plan Commission, we have always regulated shooting ranges as such, but it has never came up as an issue or complaint, to the best of my knowledge, other than the shooting range that had applied for a variance and turned down and then opened. We've not had any other complaints about shooting come to the Plan Commission. I think that we can start with this definition as it is written. And if we find that it is a problem as we go down, it's not something that cannot be changed. It can be brought to the attention of the planning commission, or it could be brought to the attention of the commissioners that the way this is written is causing a specific problem. And the process of amending the ordinance could be done again. I think we could write for the next 2-3 months and still would be able to find lots of holes to pick in it if we chose to. What's everyone's thoughts? What's their will on this?
I think it's a good idea to remove the term primarily. I don't know what anybody else thinks, but
Okay. And I would entertain a motion that we make a favorable recommendation of adding the definition of gun range, which then refers to shooting range, and the definition for shooting range as any land, property, premises, place, or facility that is used, designated, intended, or operated on a regular or standard basis, strike the word primarily, basis for the purpose of discharge of firearms and or shooting of archery equipment, whether publicly or privately owned, and whether or not operated for profit. Shooting range does not include a facility owned or operated by a municipal corporation, county, township, police district, or joint police district. Shooting range does not include accessory or incidental target practice areas on private property infrequently used by the private property owner. Any other discussion? If not, then I'd entertain a motion.
I'll make a motion to approve.
I have a first. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
All right. Any further discussion? If not, all those in favor? Aye. Opposed, same sign, passes. That finishes up for our UDO adoption.
Good question.
Mhm.
Do you want to do what we just did? Did that
Mhm.
also include page 185? The gun range, see shooting range?
Yes, that included, yes, gun range, the addition of both. I said it, when I read the proposal, it'd be on both. Yeah.
Thank you.
And I don't believe we have any other new business for this evening. Anything under the other business? You have anything for us, Commissioner Bramer?
We're moving. Stormwater management plan. I mean, the ordinances will be starting to put together, probably won't be out until early next year.
Okay. If there's nothing else, I'd entertain a,
Just a
go ahead.
question. For the January meeting, it would typically be set for January 2nd, which is a Tuesday, the first Tuesday. But could we possibly move that to January the 9th? It would be a lot easier if we could make it the 9th instead of the 2nd.
I don't have any problem with that. Does anyone else? Yeah, we can do that. You might announce when's our next December
The
meeting,
next meeting will be Tuesday, December 5.
December 5.
December 5,
All right.
yeah.
If not, I
So the 9th is also the council meeting. I don't know if that bothers anybody.
I mean, it doesn't, I was just going off the
Sure.
next Tuesday, so,
Yeah.
but I mean, we could do another day.
I don't know if it really bothers me.
Okay.
Just to let you know, so that's,
okay.
so, yeah, okay. with that.
Nothing else, I entertain a motion, we adjourn.
I so move.
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.